Welcome back, everybody, to what should be another big day here in American Government Online. We're going to talk about one of my three favorite branches of government today, the executive branch. Going back to days of yore, or back in the night if you will, and the earlier lectures in this course, we know that the Founding Fathers wanted to keep the president from gaining too much power. So in the beginning of our country, Article 2 made sure that the president had enough resources to respond to emergencies, but not nearly enough to usurp the Constitution. Article 2 actually withholds the sort of broad and easily invoked emergency powers to the executive that most governments had at the time, which was a clear indication of the skepticism that the framers had about the executive's authority. As such, the president held a limited role in government in the beginning of our nation's development, mostly acting as a chief bureaucrat and coordinating the programs that Congress passed. We discussed earlier that one of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation was that Congress had to run the bureaucracy itself. So they enjoyed the idea of the president being in charge of the day-to-day operations and the paperwork and all that fun stuff of the government. We'll see 200 years later that it still serves Congress well, as they can pass relatively vague but popular laws like the Clean Air Act, but leave the actual definition and enforcement up to the executive branch. Congress can claim all the credit for the laws, but then leave the unpleasant task of doing what the law is intended to do to someone else. Because of the president's lack of legislative authority early on, we typically saw his role as the chief clerk. He was the head of the bureaucracy and kept a fairly clear separation from the legislative process, simply serving as the top bureaucrat in the nation and ready to assume any of his official duties, like commander-in-chief at any time. Presidents in the 19th century largely worked through their department secretaries, consulting with the cabinet regularly and bringing them in on virtually all important matters. These cabinet members became important politicians in their own right, establishing an identity and responsibility for a political domain. This has clearly changed over time, as presidents have taken more responsibility into themselves and have grown more and more distant from their cabinet secretaries over time. The celebrity cabinet member still exists in some unusual circumstances, typically someone like the Secretary of State or Defense, but for the most part, presidents prefer to keep the spotlight and responsibility on themselves rather than delegating it to secretaries who may or may not be loyal to the president's agenda. Power gravitates more toward the Oval Office and the president's personal and political advisors rather than the various parts of the bureaucracy. Similarly, presidents took a much less active role in elections than they do today. Back in the night, the parties were the center of politics, and individual candidates were less important to the system than the party machine was. However, presidential candidates were the focal point of the national party's efforts and were the centerpiece of the elections. They were expected to pull the party's trains on their coattails and to distribute patronage positions to major supporters if they won. But this only happened during the election season. Otherwise, presidents typically remained in the background and let the national party do its work. Smash cut to 2002, and we see George W. Bush become the first president to really go out and advocate for his party's candidates in a midterm election. As the modern head of his party, it was his responsibility to put himself out there, go out and get members of his party elected by almost literally dragging them across the finish line. We can see someone like President Trump, who enjoys campaigning, who enjoys that sort of fight, doing something similar as we get more and more toward the permanent campaign. As the president's role in government expands, the requirements on his time increase, and the necessity of him acting as the overall head of government increases as well.